Good morning. This is WIOX. This is The Other Future. My name is Terry Tapp. I'm your host. And happy Thanksgiving to those who celebrate it, at least in the eating part of it, not the genocide. My guest today is Adam Ray Adkins. And we're beginning to have a little bit of a theme here. I talked to Ray about coming on the show because he's attached to a lot of fora online dealing with the meme of acid communism. My previous guest was Mike Watson last week, and the show comes to you every other week, but we're having a little bit of some holiday rescheduling. So my guest was Mike Watson, and Mike has written a couple of books. He's written Toward a Conceptual Militancy. He's also written Can the Left Learn to Meme? His focus is in this general ballpark that I would call acid communism. That's actually a term that came from the late Mark Fisher. Mark was looking at basically the evolution of the left in a way, and left thinking and left action politically, but also artistically, and looking at how the left could pick up from the looseness and lessons that were created through psychedelics, through art, through the 30s, the 60s, different time periods like that really, in many ways, have gone out of our political thinking. And as you may have heard, if you've listened to other episodes of the show, I've asked people to try and give me an idea of what the left is today, because there doesn't seem to be anything that we can put into an abstract or an elevator pitch, so to speak, that we could say this is exactly what we're focusing on. And I think that as crises begin to mount and overlap with climate change, with income inequality, with the consolidation of power and the oligarchy, consolidation of media, and so forth, that we're actually being pushed towards something that's very definite. So without further ado, and Adam, I should say, is a mixed media artist, and like me, he mainly is cast as an artist, though he has many other involvements too. He's a poet and does some music as well, sample-based music. He's actually put together some music from our previous guest, as I mentioned, Mike Watson. So, Adam, are you there?
Hello, Terry, I am.
Hey, how are you doing? Good morning.
Good morning, I'm doing good.
And I really appreciate you taking time today to, it's a national holiday, taking time to come on the show and talk with me. I was, you were far in advance, and it just came up that I have the show this morning, and you were kind enough to move yourself in the schedule. So,
oh yeah, it's no problem.
Let's begin with just a discussion of what I was talking about with Mike Watson. This general idea of acid communism is how I encountered you, several people in the UK and Europe. And I'm curious because, to me, it's a very pregnant phrase, very pregnant term, I should say. And I'm looking at ways of pushing it further because I think it might actually help left politics in general to explore that. What's your take on that term?
Yeah, so the term, like you mentioned a second ago, it does kind of center around Mark Fisher's writings. He was working on a book, Acid Communism, before he passed, and only got the intro out there. So there's kind of been a push in multiple directions. Myself, when I came across it, I had already been reading Fisher for a while. Capitalist Realism came out right when the Occupy movement was going on for me. I kind of read it right around that same time, and it really changed a lot of my thinking. And I see Fisher's work as a whole moving towards acid communism as kind of fighting against what he describes in capitalist realism. So bringing that social consciousness back in on itself. And then it struck me also because of being a mixed media artist, kind of starting more in the psychedelic, surreal, autonomous lane, and then growing more and more political, reading more Marx and other theorists. I started calling my work psychedelic socialism or surreal Marxism, kind of playing around with terms. And then I heard Fisher's acid communism, and it struck because the acid in there is more than the 60s counterculture drug movement. Mark kind of infamously didn't really like drugs that much, and he was writing a book about acid communism, highlighting the plasticity of it and kind of acid as a metaphor.
Right. I don't want to impose myself on listeners with this. So what's your take on the setup from capitalist realism with Mark Fisher, and why is that important to acid communism? Before you answer, let me just say for those listening, Mark Fisher started the imprint Zero Books. He was well known for his K-punk blog and his writings on punk music as well as political issues, social issues. He started Zero Books in 2009, and then I think he started Repeater Books in 2012, 2014 in there, which is another excellent imprint. You can check both of those out online, zerobooks.net, I believe it is, and I think it's just Repeater Books. But if you'll Google that, you can find all types of wonderful titles. And so his foundational book was Capitalist Realism. And Adam was just pointing out that capitalist realism, the argument that's made in there and the scenario that's depicted almost begs for something like acid communism as an idea to come. And so your take on capitalist realism, how would you describe that?
Well, I mean, the subtitle is, I think, there is no alternative.
Right.
And, yeah, that describing the psychological state that I think Mark found himself in and was increasingly seeing his students finding themselves in, of really not being able to imagine something different beyond capitalism, beyond the social life that they currently had. And he identified this in culture. In the book, he talks about music not being radically different from how it used to be. And, you hear, he talks about Kurt Cobain and how Nirvana kind of had this irony to them where they knew they were protesting the system within the system and that their protest was being sold.
Right.
And this resignation to it. So it is a depressing book in a lot of ways. He starts connecting the ideas of mental health to larger structures, where saying that it's been privatized, right. That, and that's not to say that there aren't individual problems, for biological problems, anything for people suffering from mental health, or that therapy is bad or not good, but that there are larger structures that are kind of constituting the types of people we can be within this society, or maybe where we're pushed or pulled. And so he was really identifying, I think, or putting it in more digestible terms, what Frederick Jameson was writing about in postmodernism, or the culture of late capitalism.
Right.
And you see that with Jameson's work, too, after that, kind of into the 2000s, he's really pushed into this utopian turn. Same thing with Fisher. You saw his writing become more utopian after recognizing this bleakness where even thought and imagination is facing this, commodity form and can't get past it.
Let me ask you something, and this is personal, but I view this show almost like a zine, so we're not really on, like if someone's written a book or they're doing some sort of work, we talk about that. But I'm also curious, ultimately, in an existential fashion, about the person behind the thoughts or the art. And you're encountering Fisher's work, and you said with Occupy, right? So 2011, correct?
Yeah.
How old were you at that time?
Let's see. I was 22, I believe.
Okay. And there's no valuation on that, but I'm curious because, as I was thinking the other night, and this is a thought that goes on quite a bit with me. I'm reading people that are dead. That if they were alive, they're 170 years old. I read a lot of Georges Bataille, for instance, and I was reading him in the studio the other night. And now I'm middle-aged. I just turned 52, and so if you're talking about Kurt Vonnegut was born one day later than me. So I experienced him in situ, of that time, and I experienced my disdain for some of what was going on, and my appreciation, and the movement of that time, the zeitgeist, that seemed much more hopeful. So I'm curious, if you were 22 at that time, how that was striking you, and the bleakness, especially as an artist, the bleakness of capitalism at this point, how you're experiencing it, because at that time in the early 90s, I'm thinking back to Kurt Cobain when he was hitting the national stage. I actually felt very hopeful. The internet, the public internet, was new, and I was hanging out with a lot of people that were showing me how to use things and telling me about hacking at that time, which is a different hack than what's going on now. But things felt really hopeful and open and pregnant with possibility. And I now, looking down the barrel of catastrophic climate change and looking at the, monolithic political situation, I'm curious what someone would feel. I in talking with people that are, in their teens and early 20s now, they seem very, very bleak. How did you feel about capitalist realism then? And how do you feel about that now? That, as you just described, the point of not being able to imagine else, and I'd rather. How did you feel about that then?
I think I was pretty hopeful during those times. Coming out of the Bush era, when I was in high school, I was already, I was listening to like punk rock and stuff. So I felt, somewhat politically, aware, not engaged. And then going into Occupy after that, after years of Obama, but, entering this world right as the Great Recession hits in 2008, it felt simultaneously really bad and then very hopeful. I was involved in a lot of like DIY music and art scenes at that time, like punk houses, traveling and visiting co-op.
Sorry.
Mostly Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay.
But I did start traveling there as well, and going up to the Northeast and like visiting different camps, visiting some art collectives, some just cooperative housing units,
right,
and feeling like there was something really on the rise. And then Occupy hits, and then feeling like, all right, that's it. But then getting out of that and the way it faded up, and some of the violence on multiple forms, physical, social, psychic violence that happened during all of that, really, I think we saw a slide away. But then it kind of left these kernels where we have the pickup now of like the Sanders movement, or world, in the U.S., and AOC and the Squad. And I don't know, it's kind of like those seeds of hope that were there, which seemed like they had kind of gone away, were kind of starting to blossom again, but in a different form. And honestly, it feels a lot better. It feels both more material and more aware now of larger social scale shifts that have to happen. I think with Occupy, you saw that starting to enter the conversation,
right,
less about small lifestyle changes and more systemic shifts, which could speak to like a psychedelic space, which kind of emphasizes those larger shifts.
Yeah, I feel that, or at least I'm trying to let myself feel that. But here's the interesting thing: when you if you read surrealists or Dadaists from now 100 years ago, almost. Well, no, the Dadaist 100 years ago. Their idea of a vision for the future, the anarchist of the generation before them, their idea of where we could head is so amazingly radical. And if you look at Occupy, okay, or you listen to Bernie Sanders, just listening to an interview with him by himself, actually, his lookalike. And I thought, these aren't radical demands at all. It's not even really socialism. It's just actually asking that the representational democracy function as a representational democracy. That your tax dollars go toward things that would actually benefit you, which is what's supposed to happen. And that's almost a request to stop being beaten, or a request to not be harmed in some way. I mean, it's a very conservative request. I was telling people, when the crash happened in 2008, a lot of people were protesting that they just wanted the laws to be applied, existing laws. It's not a radical demand, and I'm still wondering, like, where we can go to get to this, get over this hump. It reminds me with Mark Fisher of almost like an occlusion to the eye. Like, have you ever? This is silly, but have you ever played with the blind spot on your eye, where you could stick your finger up and your finger vanishes if you close one eye? Have you done that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is a kid game, but our situation almost reminds me of that. Like, we're trying to see that missing element of our field of vision, politically, socially, economically, or turn your head in a dream to some extent to see what is to the side. And I felt like that was something possible when in the early 90s, when the internet was coming out, and it's potentially delusional. And now I'm still, like, I'm hopeful about Sanders and the squad, and they're really the only things that I see in the federal government that's worthwhile at all. But again, their demands are very, very conservative. I did notice, like, AOC was talking about getting rid of prisons. That, to me, begins to step over the line into something much more radical and potentially wonderful. But the bleakness, the suicide rate right now among young people meaning people in their late teens, has been skyrocketing. And I don't have the figures here because we're free-flowing talking about art and politics. But it's the numbers have shot up, and I'm not surprised at all, because I feel like the hope is being drained out of things because of the lack of attention to these very conservative and basic demands. And it's something like Mark Fisher's Acid Communism that I feel is at least intellectually a direction to go into, to pave a way. Can you say, I'm not trying to just rely on you for these answers, but I'm very curious about another artist, another generation, how you take, what your take is on these things. So that's capitalist realism, this fact that we're stuck. We can't imagine another way of living. What is your take on his answer with Acid Communism?
All right. So, well, first I would like to say you're right that, I mean, obviously, yeah, they are very conservative. Just make the system work like it's supposed to. Kind of taking the ideology that capitalism wants to sell us with its human face, kind of taking it for face value and trying to apply it. So that being said, I think I'm with you in this camp of that probably wouldn't work. Like, let's say they could. Like, let's say you could just do these small tweaks and not actually affect the system. At this point, you would almost already be Like, the system itself would have to be changed so radically in order for these tweaks to even properly function. So I think that's where acid communism comes in. You know, the way it struck me with reading Mark's work towards acid communism, where I think we're going, where I want to see it go, is not waking up from a bad dream or a bad trip or whatever, you know? It's becoming lucid in a way. It's allowing for the self-direction of humanity. So it's not waking up from a dream into true reality. You know, like capitalism is the bad dream and we'll wake up into reality.
Right.
But having a better dream, dreaming better. So yeah, like trying to take the reins, if it were, and recognize all of that and be able to direct the future. And it seems, you know, I think it's always possible in some sense, or not always, but there's these moments throughout history. You know, you said in the early 90s with these revolutions happening of the early internet.
Right.
I'm sure it did seem very likely. And then, you know, me growing up and looking back on that, I can only see little glimpses of likeliness at it. I was a child at the time, but I look back and I see all these counter cultural movements that were happening, and it seems like, oh, wow, that could have done this. But it didn't. It didn't. There was something there that was missing. You know, it's not to judge the past as it happened, but to put that difference between what we thought might happen, what might be possible, versus what actually did. And to look for that hope in there and try to create a new hope while recognizing the revolutions that are going on, revolutions in society as we speak, like through meme culture, through gaming, through artificial intelligence, and all of the, you know, frankly, scary things that are going on with science that we talk about with consciousness. The discoveries, you know, we're more and more decentered all the time, whether it's through how our hollow biome, our gut bacteria interact with our brain, right. When we look at machine learning and what it's doing to production. You know, it's a frightening time to be alive, or we could try to take those things and really make them work for us, to put them to use to a society that leaves us more free.
Yeah, and this is WIOX. You're listening to The Other Future. I'm your host, Terry Tapp. My guest this week is Adam Ray Adkins. He's a multimedia artist, a poet. He's a musician, and he is involved online with acid communism. So, I agree with that. And also, from the bleakness of this current period, you know, I was listening the other day to a series of podcasts, and I heard an episode of Phil Donahue. This is an old show. I would guess you don't remember it because it was beginning to fade out when I was in my late teens. But this guy would interview people on TV, and he'd have an audience. It was actually very healthy in a way that we don't have anymore, because you had, you know, mainstream TV, and he would bring people on who were considered, you know, hot topics of that time. They might be controversial, but they at least were going to talk about a controversial subject, and so the public, whatever that means, really would be able to confront them. And they had Louis Farrakhan on there. I think he might still be, if he's still around, the head of the Nation of Islam. When I was a kid, in the papers and on television, he was demonized, and I'm not interested in anything having to do with religion, so I didn't pay attention to him because of the, you know, his Nation of Islam. I listened to this episode of Phil Donahue, and what Farrakhan was saying was actually very, very tame by today's standards. He was talking about violence toward Black Americans and institutional racism, and really simply asking that the largely white audience notice these things. not even take action, but just be aware of these things. And I was dumbfounded because I thought, how could he have been demonized when this is a very conservative request that you see, multitudes of unarmed black men being butchered by people, who are sworn to protect the public. That's horrible. Anyone with any conception of ethics would have to admit that, and that's what he's saying. and wages and treatment and opportunity, very simple conservative things. I think if you had an audience today listening to that, they would be bored, and the fact they would be bored is actually very hopeful. I didn't realize that, but we both know Mike Watson, who, as I said, was my guest last week, repeat guest now. He's published through Zero Books. At the time you were talking about in 2011 with Occupy, Zero Books was 2 years old, and the current publication manager, Douglas Lane, was running a podcast called Diet Soap, where he was really fishing for interesting philosophical takes, and having a hard time finding them in a way. He found some really wonderful people, but he was really digging to find people to talk about like situationism, Marxism, and art, surrealism and leftist politics, for instance. And now the field of people looking at these things is overwhelming. I was listening to a podcast today where Professor Richard Wolff was talking about our potential, crash or whatever next thing is going to happen economically. And he's straightforwardly a Marxist economist. That wouldn't have happened a decade ago. And that, to me, is very hopeful and says that maybe we can see through some of these things. What do you, as an artist, are you in? Do you have a community of artists that you're around that you can talk to and interact with? I mean, obviously online, everyone can do that. But are you in Tallahassee right now? Correct? Are you in Memphis?
I'm in St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg.
A better Florida city.
Okay.
So it's interesting. There are tons of artists around me. Quite a bit. St. Petersburg is a city that's really grown a lot, is a nice way of saying it. It's 15 years ago, it was nicknamed God's Waiting Room, and was known as a retirement community, basically, for the city for nearly deads or newlyweds. And now it is a huge art city, a huge nightlife culture city. It's got a lot of people move to this area all the time. I've had family here for a while, but I'm also one of these people that have moved here in hopes of kind of having an easier or nicer time with art in a city.
Right.
But my experience is I have close friends that make art. We do stuff. But as far as the arts community itself, it's there. I'm too busy working most of the time. As an independent artist, it's pretty hard to really be doing that, to support yourself. There's a select groups of people, select members that can really do that in that kind of economy, into the market economy.
Right. What jobs, if you feel like talking about that, what jobs are you doing to support yourself right now?
I work at a grocery store.
Right.
I make art. I sell art. I show in coffee shops and galleries, bars, and I'll do commissions and stuff. But for the most part, I have to work a wage labor job. And most of the artists I know are also doing that. They're having this the ability to pay rent and feed themselves and buy art supplies necessarily relies on spending most of their time doing wage labor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that's something that is, like talking about opportunity. Like, who has, what struck me about your conversation last week with Mike was when y'all were talking about the art world, about billionaires buying these paintings, what happens to art, what the art world has become. This is covered in his Can the Left Learn to Meme book as well, about art school and the art world and the gallery world, how it's become a tool of financialization, and where that leaves a lot of artists that genuinely like making art, that want to have joy to it, that want to have people that enjoy their work. In a lot of ways, it kind of forces them to have to do this because they're not selling 10,000, 100, 300,000 or $500,000 artworks to millionaires. They're selling it to their community, to their friends, for what their community and friends can afford. And that's great because those people are enjoying that artwork. But at the same time, it has this effect of putting them in that system and keeping them there and not allowing them to fully explore creative potentials, collaborative work with people, to explore new styles or schools of thought. That's
Great.
something, that's something I want to see in the art world more, is that pushing those things. Something I would like to do and see around is artists getting together, reading philosophical or political tracts, and then making gallery shows where they're multimedia representations of that book. Because a lot of people don't want to read political theory. They don't want to read philosophical theory. They're not going to read Marx. And, that's where it comes in, where you can really approach understanding in different methods.
This is an interesting thing about your work, about acid communism, about what's going on online, and that is, you're right, and most political theory is boring, and most philosophers can't write. Some of the French philosophers in the later 20th century had fascinating ideas, and yet couldn't put a sentence together. Deleuze and Guattari,
yes.
They're awful, absolutely awful. And then you have translators trying to translate them from the French to the English, and butchering that as well. So it's almost incomprehensible. Fisher picked up on some of these things, and talking in capitalist realism, but he did it, with great effort. and what I like about the fact that something like acid communism is floating around the ether, and that people like you, people in the UK, like I said, a couple of people that I picked up on French websites as well, are gravitating toward this, is once you put the funk into a system, once you push the blood through it, basically meaning once you attach art to a way of thinking and a social and political approach, you actually really give it life. If you look at the protests in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was involved with those. A lot of artists were involved in those. And in fact, I was in Washington in 2000 protesting the IMF. We were being chased by the police and all the rest of this nightmare. And I went down a street, way down the street. There was a group of people that had basically made kind of a safe space, safe in the sense of being far away from the turmoil and invisible. And they had tables set up with comic books, small comics they had made, talking about the IMF, talking about their lives, but all types of little. I got someone gave me a print, and it had it was from Crime Think. I don't know if I know it's still around, but I don't know how prominent it is. But had a guy throwing a Molotov with a couple of statements on there that really resonated with me at the time. This was important, and to see this level of art involvement, artist involvement, told me that this was a significant thing. So from 99 to 2004 maybe, that was that push was really driven by art, as its heart. No, not trying to rhyme, but having that vitality. And so when you have people on the left and they're critiquing, talking about Marx, or they're talking about an analysis of colonial situations or post-colonial and And especially if we're, having some sort of infighting about identity politics or, group dynamics that are really kind of odious. When you see something that's pulling artists in, you actually see where the life is going. And I'm really excited about that. So you were talking about artists getting together and reading these political works. And I know you've taken some of Watson's works and put them to music. Correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's I'm always a little hesitant to call myself a musician. I can play a couple instruments poorly, but the music I've been creating is all sample based. But most of my musician friends that play more traditional instruments insist that is music. It feels almost to me like collage with sound.
Sure.
But yeah, so Mike and I had been working on this. We've done a couple projects, but the one that was really calculated was I made a musical version of his book. And I read the book, took notes and highlighted some stuff, kind of found supporting ideas and speeches, found things he was referencing, and then took audio clips of him and set them to a sample-based song. And yeah, I don't know. It's a different way of approaching that. Obviously, you're not going to get the full effect of reading the book, but I think it works simultaneously to be entertaining. Personally, I think it sounds good. I hope others do.
Right.
I think it can kind of act almost as like a teaser to the book, like a prelude to get those main ideas down. Or, to someone who's not going to read the book, they can listen to a 10-minute song and still get some of those ideas and allow them to pass. Or maybe if you have read the book and then you listen to the song, they cement certain ideas or quilt them in a different way, kind of break that barrier of strict linear linguistic reasoning.
Right.
Which is something that the book talks about quite a bit, like Adorno's Shudder, and the case for abstraction over direct political sloganeering, which does have its place as well.
Right. And, I try and stay away from, I guess we call it meme culture in the sense that it's very soundbite looking to me. But I see the importance of it, and after talking with Mike and reading his works, I've come around to see that. But having read a lot of philosophy, and I guess I'll say enjoying it, I enjoy the thinking behind it and the thinking that occurs in me. But the reading is sometimes very tedious. And in teaching it sometimes and in talking with other people, it seems like, for one, most people aren't going through a long book of philosophy or even a short book. What they want are these sound bites. And, back many thousands of years now, it feels like, when I was reading more Terence McKenna and talking with people about Terence McKenna. Are you familiar with his work, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
Yeah.
I've read some McKenna. Honestly, I'm a little bit more of a Robert Anton Wilson man, but I come from reading a lot of that early psychedelia and even like the occult stuff. Yeah.
Right. And I adore Wilson. I think of him every day almost. But the thing is that most people weren't really reading a lot of what they were saying. They were picking up things from videotapes back then and the early internet, which really didn't have, it might have a sound file, but they were taking away sound bites, little clips that they could apply. And I heard in the mid-'90s where people were taking Terence McKenna's talks and they were putting them to music so that you're at a rave or you're, with some friends doing whatever, and you have this projection of music and then McKenna saying things. And, of course, there's no argument you could follow with specific premises and conclusions and evidence brought forward to music. But you can take away those little bits that allow you to incorporate them into your life. And that's what art does, and that's what an actual movement really needs. And I really appreciate that. Is there a place where people can go to see some of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a YouTube account. It's under the name Dirt, D-I-R-T, Son of Earth. I have the songs there. A lot of them have music videos that Mike made, which really compliment them. They do, I would give a strobe warning, something I've learned about pretty much most of them. They have psychedelic effects, so there are lots of changing colors, moving parts. But then I also have some painting videos on there. I have some of me reading poetry. And then where I post the most is Instagram, which is a very interesting platform, geared towards superficiality, but there's a lot of artists on there. And, it's a much more rewarding for an artist than, say, like Facebook or something like that. And you can find me on there at art.o.dirt. D-I-R-T again. And then I started posting recently on TikTok, which is a very interesting and weird new media social platform. Are you familiar with TikTok?
No, actually, I followed, Mike Watson had a live talk on Twitch, and I got a Twitch account, and it's actually funny because I followed gaming culture as an outsider only because I think the graphics are interesting, and as a lifelong comic book reader and devotee of that medium, I remember, even when I was a kid, people talking about how, the juvenile delinquency that would come from reading comic books, the waste of time, the mental rot that was going to happen, and those same arguments are applied to gaming culture, which kind of opens my heart to it. So I got on Twitch and they asked me, you have to follow these games and I don't play games. I mean, I paint and draw and sculpt and tattoo and read and write, but I don't have time for sitting in front of a computer, playing. So I pick certain things. But Mike Watson had a live discussion on Twitch, and so I have Twitch and Snapchat. But I've seen the mention of TikTok. Tell me more about that.
So TikTok is a short video app, and let's say I think the majority of videos seem to be 30 seconds, but I think they can be up to a minute. Now, the platform in general, you can add music, sound bites. It has a filter set where you can add, glitchy effects, mirrors. You can make your video a negative, things like that. So it's very easy to make these short little videos. It's kind of picked up where Vine left off. But it's dominated by a very young crowd that mostly uses it for lip syncing. So, it's not like super great or anything, but there's been a number of breakthroughs, like viral things that have come through there that have a more political bent to them. Like, for instance, there was I believe it was a makeup tutorial just yesterday that went viral that had a message about the Hong Kong protest, within the makeup tutorial, as this, young woman is giving her makeup tutorial, she mentions this thing, and it has gone incredibly viral. There's been a lot of comedians that make political satire on there, or explain in very short seconds some political theory. And then there's a growing number of artists that are using it too. So I'm kind of just dipping my toes in there and exploring it. But I think that's important for artists, especially if they want to work in any of these means of trying to stay on the social beat, and if you're trying to influence any of this or talk about political or societal issues, really be engaged with it. I'm not a video gamer myself either. It's a strange thing for my generation to not be a video gamer.
And it's not necessarily generational. I have to say, I was tattooing in Manhattan for a number of years, and the shop I was tattooing at, there was a gentleman who was my age or older who had immigrated from Israel, and he and the shop floor manager would have intense discussions about who they needed to kill and where they needed to go on what planet. It would get very heated, and the owner of the shop was like me, very busy, so he's not playing games. But we mocked them and laughed at them because these were very intense discussions, and they lived in that gaming culture. I don't hold it against them. It sounded very funny to me, and I mock a lot of people for different reasons. But it was gentle mocking, and so you can be. My daughter isn't a gamer. My son isn't a gamer, and they're obviously a much younger generation. So it's not necessarily generational. I mean, it has to be to some extent because of when games became prominent. But yeah, it's interesting to me to see these technologies evolve, and I wonder, a decade ago. Over a decade ago, when the Bush regime of W. Bush was in power, these comedians had to come out and talk about the news because you couldn't talk about the news on the news, and it became more and more obvious that if you're watching televised news or in that nascent computer broadcasting type situation, that you were looking at an actor who is paid by a corporation to read these lines. So you have the Jon Stewarts and the Stephen Colbert at that point that were coming on to actually give you news, but to do it as comedy. And so I kind of see like this technology and this big meme, acid communism, that I'm really enjoying, pushing something new coming out, where you can maybe we actually can get closer to not just delivering information to each other, but actually like provoking action and more advanced thought. I don't know what word I want to give to that, but it's creeping forward, and it has to as we get closer to the edge of the precipice here. So I like that, but I didn't know anything about TikTok. Do you find with these, the strobe warnings on this, have you ever played around with William Burroughs' Dream Machine?
I actually, no, I have not. I know what you're referring to, but I've never played around with it.
It's interesting because, and there's actually a very good book on the Dream Machine itself, but William Burroughs and Brian Geisen would play with the Dream Machine, which is essentially a turntable or some sort of contraption like that, but a turntable will work. And you take a cylinder of metal, actually a sheet, and cut shapes out of it in a specific pattern. You can find these online now, of all things. And then roll them into a cylinder, put a light inside that, turn the lights off in a room, close your eyes, and activate whatever instrument which is turning, so your turntable. So the pattern of light falling on your eyelids will give you a sort of psychedelic experience, but it can produce an epileptic seizure, and so that's where that warning comes in. But I noticed Watson has a video through Zero Books. I don't know if you were involved with this or who was involved. It's just out now, and I saw the responses to it. A lot of applause and a lot of groaning because of the swirling colors, the mix of his voice with different images, trying to get to psychedelic experience, which I thought was fascinating. I mean,
that sounds like something that I worked on with him. And that's been something that we've noticed, a lot of complaints about that. But there is, it's kind of overloading the senses in a lot of ways, which a psychedelic experience can do. But to continue with that language, you kind of have to float down the stream and get to the point where that sensory overload isn't disruptive. Like that's like in the psychedelic experience. So Robert Anton Wilson would talk about the Chapel Perilous.
Yeah,
I think it's how it's called. Yeah, with that moment where it's like you've had it, and you're either going to enter some kind of enlightenment state or paranoid insanity.
Yeah,
and
breakdown.
That's what the breakdown, and that's what I think. a lot of that is like what we're trying to do with that. That's what a lot of my personal artwork does too, kind of mixes this extreme chaos with moments of stillness, and building just up to a narrative to where it, and then tearing that narrative down, kind of going in and out of moments of lucidity and more abstraction, and allowing the other person, the viewer, to build these bridges, connect thoughts, come to conclusions on their own, rather than just giving them this sign they can hold.
Right, and I think, to tie that in, since we're getting close to the end of the hour, with acid communism, the acid communism, what's interesting about that is that kind of, Chapel Perilous state that Wilson was talking about can actually, if you can reach that, whether it's through art or, through awareness of these crises that are going on or whatever you may need, if you can get to that state, you could actually see past that occlusion, past that moment that has left us without other possibilities, and see some other way of acting, another way of organizing ourselves economically, politically. That to me is where we need to head and where this meme can take us. But it's important. I've actually thought about writing about this or interviewing people about this, to look at how artists function in this kind of society, because most artists make very little to nothing from their art, and most are involved with wage labor, something that they find disdain for. Not that people who make art enjoy that, but they're doing something otherwise, and it's always seemed to me like extremely frustrating that I could be doing something else, but I've had to be a steel fitter or whatever I'm doing. But there is this. I know you. I would totally assume you've seen the movies renditions of 1984.
Yeah.
Have you actually read the book?
I read about half of it in high school, and I honestly, I know this sounds weird, I thought it was boring, and I stopped reading it. I was like, this is a weird love story that is going nowhere, and I just felt it really hyped up. But I have seen the movies.
Well, there's a scene in the book that most people that I talk to don't recall, but it is in there. And when Winston goes into the prole sector, there's a cafe, and in some of the movie renditions, he goes in and there's an old man who serves him some booze, and doesn't seem to have any political awareness at all. But in the book, when he's going to this cafe in the prole sector, there are artists there. There are musicians, there are painters. It's something that people don't recall, because it doesn't stand out at all. But I actually love that Orwell put that in there, because that to me, in the bleakness of the book itself, is the one little moment of color, where you actually have people who haven't given in to the overwhelming monolith of the ideology that's going on right then, and waving banners and having the party line in some way, or the inner circle of the party or whatever. But they're not beaten by the system, to use that older phraseology. And I like to see that, like I said, online, when you see the acid communism forums, and you're in that, you're an administrator, correct?
Mm-hmm.
When you're in that and dealing with people, like that to me is a really hopeful moment, or splash of color, and a lot of bleakness right now. We're almost out of time. Let me go over a couple of things. This is WIOX. You're listening to The Other Future. I'm your host, Terry Tapp. My guest this week is Adam Ray Adkins. He is a mixed media artist. He's a poet. He's a sample-based musician. I wanted to have you read some of your poetry, but you could return and we can do something like that. I want to send people right now where they can read it and where they can see some of your work, and that is on Instagram at art.o.dirt, and on YouTube at Dirt Son of Earth. Also, totally not totally off topic, but on a lighter note, Dirt Son of Earth. Where did you get that?
Well, you know, I first adopted it when doing graffiti work, some more graffiti work and being more anonymous. But then also, you know, a moniker can be kind of fun. So I started signing my art like that. And it's a play on some stuff, some symbolism that I'm always working with, some inversion of things, and a direct play on my name.
Oh, okay. You know, I thought it was, this is an ancient thing, but in the back of Creepy Magazine and Eerie Magazine, these like black and white magazines out of Warren Publishing from the 60s and 70s. I think they stopped in the early 80s. They actually, artists went there when the comic book self-censorship happened in the 50s, and they made these fantastic stories. But in the back of the magazine, you would have listings of products, and they would have albums of stories and effects, horror stories, and they would be like horror, son of terror, fright, son of horror, and it amused me to think of someone coming up with these, because, you know, how would you decide the family lineage on that? But Adam, thank you so much for coming on, and you know, whatever you celebrate today, happy that, and I really